What's up guys, Shindig here, and welcome to a commentary of Heroic 25-man Rotface. Now before the pull even begins, it's good to have your ranged and healers that are stationed outside of melee range pre-spread around the edge of the room. You can actually stand outside of this ring and you don't pull the boss. This is good just to get slightly better uptime when the pull actually begins, such that you're not having to move after entering combat with Rotface. We want our range to be spread here for Vgas. This ability will target a random ranged player. Assuming you have at least 8 players in ranged, make sure you do this, otherwise every melee is going to be hit by Vgas, and it's not going to be super fun. Now Vgas was actually one of 2 abilities that we don't believe was working as intended. The other ability has since been fixed, and I'll kind of get to that, at least when we tested this encounter. But Vgas is supposed to deal damage to its target, and anyone within, I think, 7 to 8 yards of them, and disorient those players. However, there are cases of players both being disoriented and not being disoriented while they have the debuff. So I'm not sure if there's some kind of condition that needs to be met in order for the disorient to go off. If you maybe know more about it, comment below, let me know. But in any case, it still doesn't change the fact that it's good to have ranged players spread out to try and avoid chaining other players with this debuff. The other mechanic that wasn't quite working as intended when we tested this boss was the little slimes kind of pulsing AoE damage. I think it's called weak radiating ooze. It just wasn't dealing any damage. So that has since been fixed. I have seen logs where that damage has been registered, but at least in our kill, that damage just was non-existent. Those 2 mechanics aside, there's basically 2 main things that will wipe you on this fight. The first thing is ad management. Now, and this is kind of like the soft enrage for the fight, but Rotface will apply mutated infection on a random raid member, and he applies this more frequently the longer the fight goes on. Looking at one of our logs, for example, I think it was about 15 seconds between applications towards the start of the encounter, and right towards the end, it was about 6 seconds between applications. So being able to manage these ads becomes increasingly more difficult the longer the fight goes on. For ad management, basically you're gonna get this debuff on you. It deals about 5,000 damage per second on heroic, and it's a 75% healing reduction, which is actually pretty brutal, especially if the player is in range and doesn't have a lot of healer coverage, depending on how kind of you spread your raid around the boss. This can be a little bit tricky to navigate. And so in general, the safest thing is to just immediately dispel. There can be an exception, and I'll actually go back here. So for the first application of mutated infection, so it's going out here in 2 seconds. See who it goes on. It's on Peridotto. It's now that weak rating, actually the fact that it's on a range is fine, but let's say this was on a player in melee. Your melee player would ideally want to keep DPSing the boss. This is during Lust, right? You're pressing Lust and Pull, just kind of where you get the most value out of this ability. It's good to kind of delay that dispel, because if you dispel preemptively, then the little ooze spawns, will do its pulsing AoE damage to everyone in melee, and just kind of, it's unnecessary damage, or damage at least that you could avoid. So if melee gets it, you kind of just hang out, don't need to dispel it right away. If a range gets it, in this case, I mean, they're hanging out either way. You can dispel the ranged if you feel it's safer. Generally, it's easier to heal somebody with a small slime on them than it is to probably heal the debuff, but that's assuming the player is kind of standing out on their own. So in this case, we do dispel it right away. It is on a ranged. The nice thing about it being on a ranged is that this person just plants, and the next person that gets the mutated infection debuff will know to run to this person. So it happens to be on Dose here. This is actually a really kind of hilarious lineup. Dose is our cutting tank, so the person that we have responsible for cutting the big oozes around the room. So this lineup works out great, but the idea is that you're going to merge these 2 little ads together, and then Dose, our cutting tank, is going to kite the big ooze in a circle around the perimeter of the room. Now, then every other person that gets the mutated infection debuff, so we see it just went on Isles, is then going to move towards the big ooze, merge their little ooze with the big ooze, and then run back to, DPS the boss, heal, whatever they're doing. Important thing here, if you're a person that has the little ooze on them or needs to merge it, try not to stand on top of the big ooze, at least as much as you can help it. The big ooze actually does a pretty high damage, pulsing, irradiating damage aura for anyone within melee. So if you can try and navigate your kiting your little ooze into the big ooze while, taking as little damage as possible, Maybe this is through movement abilities or using boots. It's generally high value. Just any damage you can mitigate is obviously quite good. One more thing about cutting the big ooze. So if you're the tank that's assigned to cutting the large ooze, so big ooze around the room, let's just go back a little bit here. What's important for you, and you see our tank running through the green slime. If you're a DK, you can press AMS and it'll stop you from gaining stacks and kind of lets the stacks drop. If you're a paladin, you can press freedom. When you're running through the big ooze here, it applies a stacking dot that does increasing damage, but also reduces your movement speed. So that's why abilities like freedom will drop it. AMS will also allow you to stop taking stacks, so you can get through that puddle. Now, as the cutting tank, you can, I'm just gonna pause here. So you see our tank going through the slime. You can alternatively turn around and go the other way if you don't want to run through the ooze puddles here. I personally am not a huge fan of this because I think it's very important on this fight as the cutting tank that you are predictable, right? The other players in the raid need to be able to easily identify where you're going such that they can merge their little ooze with your big ooze. So if you all of a sudden 180 here and somebody's, sees you moving this direction and plan for you to come out the other side, all of a sudden they have to take their little ooze on, a marathon to get to where your new position is now going to be. So in general, I think just moving in a circle, even if it means moving through these flooded ooze sections, is good value. And if you're, let's say you're a prop paladin and you've already pressed freedom, and maybe the ooze puddle moves from this spot to, a spot on the bottom left of the screen here, or your DK that's already pressed AMS and it's on cooldown, you can always call for an additional freedom from another paladin or something of the sort. So I think being predictable is quite valuable. Just makes it easier for people to merge their little ooze with you. Once the 5 little oozes have been merged with the big ooze, then we're going to see unstable explosion. So I'm actually going to go back a little bit here. I want to highlight something with unstable explosion. So I mentioned there are 2 things that will wipe you in this fight. The first thing is ad management, right? So that's just kind of the entire process I discussed. The second most important mechanic of this fight is the Ooze Explosion. So what we see here on the right is the big ooze casting unstable Ooze Explosion. Now, when this cast goes off, it's going to throw a bunch of little green ooze balls at your current location the moment this cast timer reaches 0. So as a ranged player, just find somewhere in the room where nobody's standing and then move to that spot. The travel time of these oozes is determined by how close you are. So the ooze is going to take, 10 to 15 seconds to reach the Shadow Priest's location, so they have lots of time. But say this Warlock here, it's going to take, maybe 5 seconds to get that spot. Maybe less, maybe like 3 seconds. So they'll have to react a little bit faster to make sure they don't get hit. For melee, what's important is we stack on X, and this was kind of the idea. If your melee can stack on a single position, all of the oozes that go out will be in one location, such that your melee, when they move to a new spot, are safe and can maintain uptime. So you can kind of treat this as like Algalon's Comet Smash, where you want to be stacked on one foot, the Ooze Explosion goes off, and you move to the other foot. So we actually do a pretty decent job of that, despite being a little bit spread out before. So we follow X, X is safe, we're all stacked there, all the oozes go out there. But we see some falling a lot later for 2 players that were standing further from the explosion when it happened, right? So there's a difference in travel time there. The next 2 players with little oozes on them are going to merge their 2 oozes outside of melee range, and this is important. Again, a big ooze in melee is very, very deadly. And we return to cutting the boss. And you're basically just repeating this. It gets a little bit more tricky to navigate. Big oozes gain their stacks faster because more mutated infections are going out at a more frequent rate. One thing that your main tank or Rotface tank can do to kind of mitigate some additional damage, and this is the last mechanic I haven't really talked about, is Slime Spray. So how Slime Spray works, it's a frontal that deals kind of damage during the duration of the cast, and it targets the location of a random player. Now, this is the first time our Prop Paladin tank was seeing this fight, so we didn't really stress this too much, but something that can be done to kind of alleviate the stress on ranged players in particular is you want to have your Rotface tank always position their back to the ooze puddles here. So in this case, I think he's turned around for using mutated infection, right? So this isn't a great example, but ideally you want your melee to be on the side that the flooded ooze is, because you'll never have range there. So if a melee gets targeted by slime spray and they're on this side of the boss, right, slime spray is not going to hit anyone because melee can just easily move out of the way. Range generally don't want to move for this mechanic, or it's not really worth it. So you can bait those slime sprays away from your range players, and that can be pretty valuable in this encounter. But again, we don't do that here, and we still end up, I think we one-shot this fight, so you know, it's not at all necessary. If you decide not to do this, you're kind of pushing more of the responsibility to survive in this fight on your range players who already kind of have a more difficult job, but it's not like an extreme curve in difficulty. However, it's, you know, I generally recommend having your melee do it because your melee otherwise are not really doing much this fight. They just kind of follow the boss and hit it and stay behind it. So I think pretty soon here we see, yeah. So I actually get mutated infection. We're going to see an example of sort of what to do during. So I get the little ooze, I'm bringing it to the big ooze, but this is actually an edge case here. So as I'm bringing it, the big ooze actually reaches 5 stacks of the unstable, the ooze debuff, so it's going to explode. So I basically can't merge my little ooze with the big ooze. So what I do is I understand, okay, well, I can't merge, so I need to wait for another little ooze and merge with that one. So as a melee, I A, move out of the spot I was once in so I don't get hit by the ooze explosion, and B, I just hang around the outside waiting for somebody else with a little ooze to merge theirs together. And once that happens, I go back to DPSing the boss. Now, something that's worth highlighting is that the interaction of merging oozes can be a little bit, I want to say buggy or just not predictable, in the sense that we see these little oozes are close, you know, I assume they merge, so I boots back to the boss to start doing damage again, but they don't really urge. We see merge. We see this one actually follows me for a little ways before they end up merging. So there can be some strange interactions, and what our tank, so our prop paladin tank actually does a really good job. He recognizes the fact that there's a big ooze close to melee, and so we move away from it. Because again, the pulsing AoE damage that goes out from these things is pretty large. So you just, as long as they're away from the raid, you're safe. But if they come a little bit too close, then that's quite dangerous. We end up getting 2 big oozes emerging on the outside of the room. You can manage this. You just want, they'll merge back into one big ooze as soon as they come within, you know, distance to merge of each other. So that's fine. Tank resumes navigating, and at this point, we're just blasting the boss. That's pretty much Rotface. Manage all of that, and the boss should go down. Thanks for watching.